Imagine waking to the sound of water under your feet, not the distant crash of waves from a beach, but the constant, close presence of the sea. The gentle sway of a house on stilts, the slow slap of a hull against piling, the soft chorus of drip and wind that marks the hours. For some people, that sound is not a visit or a vacation. It is the house, the school, the market, and the graveyard. It is the measure of time, the calendar of seasons. It is home. I came here to understand what it means to build a life where land does not exist as a primary foundation, to meet the communities that have organized marriage, work, religion, and political identity around water. We will travel across Southeast Asia to 5 maritime peoples whose skills, bodies, and stories are threaded to the sea. The Bajau Laut of the Philippines, the Moken who keep moving along the Andaman waters, the Sama and Sama Dilaut who blend boat and shore, the Orang Laut of the Strait of Malacca and the Bajal of Sabah. Each of them offers a different answer to the same question. How do you make a world when the world itself is fluid? The first image you should hold is simple and physical. Lean down, close enough to feel the spray, and look at the water under your feet. It is not blue immediately under the boards, but dark and moving, filled with life and the shifting light of the sun. Children here learn the language of tides before they learn the names of streets. Their playgrounds are narrow decks and coral reefs. Their first teachers are parents who fish and grandparents who read currents like pages of a book. This is not a story about exotic survival or romantic escape. It is about the long-tested technology of living on the water, practices passed by example and song, bodies adapted across generations, legal and social systems sometimes blind to their existence, and modern forces that push and pull those ways of life toward an uncertain future. It is a story of skill and dignity, and of knowledge the wider world has only begun to recognize. We begin with the Bajau Laut. They live where boats and stilts set the horizon. From a distance, their villages look like an arrangement of stilted rooftops and narrow walkways, a constellation of wooden platforms floating above shallow sea. At first light, you see lines of children paddling small skiffs, women sorting yesterday's catch, men sharpening spears for the day's freediving. The architecture of these places is a negotiation with water. Houses raised on poles, roofs that catch both rain and light, ladders that lead to sea instead of a garden. For Bajau families, the ocean is not simply resource, it is identity. Many identify as sea people first and nationality second. Their boats are homes, reefs are cupboards, and breath control is as common an art as cooking. Children are introduced to water at an age that would surprise most onlookers. Some wade and swim before they walk along narrow planks. Small hands learn to balance on rocking boats that feel like second skin. This daily rhythm produces practices that are precise and purposeful. Freediving, the form of diving without scuba gear, relying only on breath, is not a sport but a necessity. A typical morning for a Bajau fisher can begin before sunrise, when the sea is silver and the reef is still asleep. They dive repeatedly, sometimes for minutes at a time, to reach fish and invertebrates that shelter just below the surface. Spears and simple weights, knowledge of currents and reef topography, trained bodies, these are their tools. Science has taken notice, and in 2019, a study published in Cell drew attention to a physiological pattern among some Bajau populations. The researchers reported that many Bajau divers have larger spleens than their neighbors who live on land. The spleen, among other functions, acts as a reservoir of oxygen-rich red blood cells that can be released into circulation during extended breath holds. In other words, the organ can serve as a biological supplement to breath training. It is important to say exactly what the study did not say. This finding is not a claim that genes fully determine who becomes a diver, or that any body is destined for life at sea. It is a piece of evidence showing a difference that correlates with long-standing breath-hold diving traditions in some communities. Cultural practice, training, and choice remain central. When I spoke with a mother named Layla, translated from her words, she smiled and tapped the worn ladder beside her house. "My baby prefers the hull to a bed," she said. "He reaches for the water like for a bowl." Her boy, maybe 3 years old, leaned over the edge and clapped his hands at a small fish that flashed by. Layla told me that children here learn to control breath because elders teach them to respect the sea. "We teach them by small games, by staying close, by watching," she said. "We do not push them into the deep. They learn with time." That emphasis on transmission, a steady, patient passing of skill, is as important as any data about organs. Technique, caution, and communal oversight keep these children alive long before any study notes a physical difference. The physiological finding is notable because it shows how culture and biology can co-evolve. Sustained practices over generations can select for traits that make those practices safer or more efficient. But the story is not merely biological, it is social. The spleen-sized finding sits beside stories of apprenticeship, of jokes on the day's catch, of old women who still sing to nets and tell weather from the angle of clouds. There is another dimension to Bajau life that is often unseen by visitors: legal and civic invisibility. Many Bajau communities live on the sea in ways that fall between conventional state categories. For some, lack of formal identification or documentation has made access to education, healthcare, and legal rights precarious. The sea offers autonomy and shelter, but also a vulnerability. If national systems treat residency and citizenship as land-bound, entire ways of life can be marginalized. This is not to paint a single narrative of victimhood. Bajau people have shown resilience, creativity, and political agency in many contexts. They negotiate with local authorities, adapt their strategies, and preserve cultural practice in the face of pressure. Still, the structural reality of modern states, paperwork, fixed boundaries, port regulations, creates frictions many of these communities did not historically face. A boat that once navigated freely now meets checkpoints, fees, and competition from industrial fleets. I stood on a raked wooden pier as the sun burned through morning mist, while a fisherman named Ismail prepared his spear. He laughed when I asked about fear. "Fear is part of the sea," he said, "but so is respect. We learn both." His hands were calloused, his eyes steady. He had papers, he told me, but his neighbors did not. Stories like his point to an uneven map of belonging, where the sea becomes both refuge and a space where rights are negotiated in practice rather than guaranteed by law. But if the Bajau story teaches one major lesson, it is this: the ocean is a school. The skills of freediving, controlled breathing, equalization of pressure, efficient movement are taught in informal, highly social ways. Young divers practice with older ones. A watchful group makes repeated dives safe. Knowledge is stored not only in organs but in rhythm and memory. When researchers come with their instruments and journals, they can read these practices as signals of adaptation. What is more difficult to measure is the network of relations, the songs, the jokes, the rules about where to fish and when to rest, the cultural scaffolding that makes survival possible and dignified. Near dusk, the village gathered by the water to sell and swap nets, exchange recipes, and tell stories that kept everyone aware of reefs and shoals. A teenager named Rafi showed me the carved notch on his boat's side, where his father had repaired a storm hole years ago. "We fix things," he said matter-of-factly. "We don't throw things away like the big ships do." He was joking about garbage, but the point was serious. Small-scale, low-energy lifeways often leave ecological traces different from industrial ones. The Bajau have intimate knowledge of reef health, where sea cucumbers live, which coral beds are recovering, which currents bring sargassum. That knowledge is practical, measured daily, and transmitted in ways formal science rarely records. The morning after I first arrived, an older man named Salim invited me on a short trip beyond the reef. We slipped under a sky thin with cirrus, and he showed me how he read the water. A faint line in the swell indicating a passing current, a subtle darkness suggesting deeper troughs, a cluster of birds hovering where the surface life is concentrated. The eyes had decades of practice. "The sea speaks," he told me. "If you listen, you know the right time to go." The wonder of watching someone who has spent a lifetime reading the sea is not just awe at competence. It is the recognition that entire epistemologies, ways of knowing, are embedded in these practices. For the Bajau, knowledge is body deep. It is in the way they move, in the rhythm of their dives, in the names they give to gusts and shoals. That is the first block of this film, to show that living on water is not an adaptation of convenience, but a full, complex life system that interweaves culture, ecology, and physiology. If this story resonates, if you want to continue discovering how people have remade the world on water, subscribe and join us on the next leg of the journey. From the Philippines, we travel west, across a sweep of turquoise and deeper blue, to a different set of practices, the mobile, itinerant life of the Moken. If the Bajau have been defined by breath and platforms, the Moken are defined by motion and senses. For the Moken, moving along the coastline is not a failure to establish roots, it is the route. Their lives have been organized around kabang trees and kabangs, slender long boats that slip along archipelagos and island fringes. They travel with the seasons, anchoring in sheltered coves to fish and forage, then lifting anchor to follow fish schools or the fruiting patterns of coastal forests. A Moken village at dawn looks like a scattering of shelters on low islands, babies wrapped and cradled in slings, nets drying on frames, and elders mending gear. But what marks many Moken is how they read the sea's subtle signals, the behavior of birds, the color of foam on the surface, the smell of water carried on an incoming breeze. This is not superstition. It's a living sensorium, a set of practices and oral knowledge that functions as early warning and navigation. There is an extraordinary historical example that illustrates how these forms of knowledge can save lives. In December 2004, when the Indian Ocean erupted with seismic energy and sent the tsunami across coasts, many Moken oral histories recorded the sea's withdrawal before the big wave arrived. Elders told younger people that when the water pulls back in a way unusual for the place, it is a sign to move inland and seek high ground. In several Moken communities along the Andaman coasts, this knowledge, combined with a culture of mobility, resulted in markedly fewer casualties than in neighboring populations, who either did not interpret the signs or who lacked the social mechanisms to act quickly. I met an elder named I, who had been a young adult during the 2004 event. His translation was measured. "The water moved like a hand pulling away," he said quietly. "We had been taught to know that movement. We took our children and ran to the hills. Many people came to our place after and asked how we survived. We only did what our grandparents had taught us." Stories like Eyes sit beside scientific literature that explored perceptual skills among sea-oriented children. A 2003 study published in Current Biology examined Moken children's ability to accommodate vision underwater. That is, to change the eye's focus in ways that allow clearer sight beneath the surface. The researchers found evidence that Moken children, compared to some non-diving peers, showed remarkable underwater visual accommodation, a skill likely shaped by experience rather than simple inheritance. This again points to the complex interplay between environment, practice, and development. Repeated exposure to water-based tasks changes perception and skill across childhood, producing abilities optimized for a watery lifeway. Yet the Moken life, like the Bajau, is vulnerable in modern contexts. Mobility can be criminalized when borders become strict, tourism swallows up landing sites, and state policies encourage settlement in fixed villages. For a people whose technology for survival is mobility, the knowledge that lets you move from safe cove to safe cove, the imposition of fixed state frameworks can be lethal in practical and cultural terms. If you force people to stay, you can undermine the very knowledge that protects them. I sat on a low rock while young Moken children chased crabs, their laughter rising above the low thrum of boats. Their teacher, a woman who had taken it upon herself to keep certain elders' stories alive, showed me a small string of tokens used to recall specific landmarks and fish behavior. "We made this for the children," she said, "so they remember where the fishing is good and where to avoid storms." That string was not a toy. It was mnemonic technology, memory made portable, meant to be read and interpreted along a coast that moves. One Moken father, speaking in a quiet tone, said, "Our life is like the tide. Sometimes we are here, sometimes further. If they keep telling us to stay on land, we will forget how to hear the sea." There is urgency in that sentence that is not melodrama. Cultural transmission is fragile in the face of sedentarization. When the elders die, how will their stories be carried forward if there are few young people spending hours at sea to learn the subtle signs? Part of the Moken survival strategy is storytelling and ritual. Songs mark fishing spots. Chants recall the rhythms of moon and wind. Initiation practices teach the rules for when to go and when to stay. The culture encodes safety with poetry. The poetic mapping is efficient and robust, but it depends on context. Children need the water, the elders need a place to teach, and the social frameworks need the freedom to move. At the same time, Moken communities have engaged with outside authorities in varied ways. Some have taken up schooling to gain literacy and access to healthcare. Others have resisted schooling that competes with traditional transmission. The result is often a hybrid, new skills layered over old ones, with tensions and creative adaptations. A Moken teenager I spoke with wanted to be a teacher, so she went to a nearby town to study. She returned each season to fish and practice what she'd learned. Her life was not a binary choice, it was a negotiation. An image I keep returning to is this: a child perched on a small boat, eyes trained to the water, fingers flipping a shell to see which way the water runs. Next to the child, an elder hums a refrain that names currents. That duet, hands and voice, sight and chant, is the Moken's heart. It is a knowledge economy calibrated to the sea, maintaining life over long distances and through sudden crisis. When researchers publish findings like the 2003 Current Biology paper, they bring attention to capabilities that are acquired, impressive, and practical. But the scientific frame alone misses the lived terms. How knowledge is taught by the hearth and the hull, how it is embedded in songs and jokes, how it is constrained or enabled by policy, and how it connects people to place, or in the Moken case, to a moving place. From the Moken we move, in our itinerary, to the wider family of Sama and Sama Dilaut peoples. The Sama are a larger, more diverse web of communities whose lifeways vary along a spectrum. Some live primarily on boats, some primarily in stilt villages above shallow seas, and many others in combinations of both. Their boats are a form of home, but they also maintain more sustained contact with onshore markets and state infrastructures. That hybridity makes them an ideal lens for exploring how maritime identity evolves in contact zones where tourism, marine development, and conservation policies intersect. A summer village at midday is noisy and pragmatic. Children shout from decks, nets clatter on drying racks, a small generator ticks as someone irons a shirt, Ritual remains essential, offerings to sea spirits, prayers for smooth voyages, but so do the demands of modern life, selling fish for cash, paying for education, getting medicines. The Sama exhibit a capacity for flexibility that has been central to their survival historically. When new engines arrive, they learn to maintain them. When markets change, they find new products to sell. There is a human tension here that will frame the next part of our film. A tug-of-war inside families about what future to choose. In one household I visited, an elder insisted on the value of boat life, recalling decades of small boat diplomacy with neighboring communities. A teenager in the same household listened to stories, but she also dreamed of a school on land with books and electricity. "I love the sea, but I want to study," she told me. That simple line carries complex consequences. If youth choose land, or are compelled to by policy or opportunity, the apprenticeship chain that keeps marine knowledge alive loosens. Sama rituals illustrate how spiritual life is entangled with practicality. Offerings to the sea are not simply superstition, they are part of an ethics of reciprocity. The sea is a partner in a relationship, given thanks and treated with rules about what and when to take. Many Sama people describe the sea as a kin, a living presence that requires moral relations. We decline to call this primitive or backward, and instead aim to present it as a coherent worldview with real consequences for resource management. Animist practices often embody restraint. They limit overharvest and prescribe seasonal observances that align with ecological cycles. Yet pressures abound. New motorized fleets can overfish in ways non-mechanized fleets cannot. Ports are built where people have anchored for centuries. Tourism packages commodify boat trips without compensating communities fairly, and legal frameworks that imagine property as fixed plots of land struggle to accommodate fluid claims that cross mangrove lines and shoals. The result is friction that is often felt most keenly at the household level. An inability to access a new market, the loss of a favored fishing spot to a trawler, or the disappearance of a landing point to a resort. I will follow the Sama story further in the next segment. For now, hold the image of a young woman at dusk, her hair damp from a day on the water, her palm pressed to the hull like a prayer or a claim, trying to decide whether the future she wants will ask her to leave behind the best classroom she ever had, the sea. Across these first communities, a set of themes already appears: bodies and senses adapted to water, oral and embodied knowledge that functions as technology, and a growing set of pressures reshaping life on the sea. We have moved from the Bajau's breath and spleen studies to the Moken's perceptual skills and tsunami wisdom, to the Sama's hybrid choices between land and water. The deeper we go, the more we find that the sea is not simply a stage for human action, but a teacher, a partner, and a contested resource. There are scientific footprints on this human geography. As I mentioned earlier, the 2019 study in Cell brought wider attention to one physiological pattern among Bajau divers. The 2003 Current Biology paper highlighted acquired visual accommodation among Moken children, and recent genetic work, such as a 2021 analysis by researchers affiliated with the University of Copenhagen, has suggested shared variants among maritime populations that could relate to oxygen regulation. Each of these studies offers a different window into how long-term lifeways and environmental pressures are reflected in bodies and genes. But none of them can stand alone as an explanation. Social organization, cultural transmission, economic choices, and state frameworks sculpt lives in ways that no gene can fully explain. In the places where I filmed, science and lived knowledge often met in productive ways. A doctor explaining spleen physiology sat beside an elder, explaining where to cut a net to avoid damaging coral. A geneticist spoke with fishermen who kept oral genealogies of long-distance relatives. These encounters were not episodes of translation in which one side simply taught another. They were conversations that revealed different priorities and different tools. One aimed at mechanisms and generalization, the other at immediate survival and everyday ethics. But there is also urgency. Industrial fishing fleets widen their reach, coastal development eats into landing sites, legal invisibility leaves families without a stable claim to resources or services. These forces are not the same everywhere, and states interact with sea peoples in a variety of ways, sometimes with accommodation, sometimes with indifference, sometimes with coercion. I will not draw simplistic lines of blame. What I will show is how these pressures converge to erode the conditions under which maritime knowledge is passed forward. As dusk thickened over the stilt villages and drifting boats, I watched children climb the ladders and practice the small balance tasks that are a schooling unto themselves. An old woman told a story about a reef that had provided for generations and was now quieter. "It used to sing," she said. "Now it hums." Her sadness was measured, not theatrical. It was a description of change, fewer fish, different currents, new boats that took their steady catch. We will next turn from the lively hybridity of the Sama to the historical arcs of the Orang Laut, and then to the contemporary flashpoint in Sabah, where modern infrastructure, tourism, and industrial fleets squeeze traditional territories. But before we go further, I want you to hold one image: children diving off a small pier, silhouetted against a low sunset, their bodies learning the rhythms that supported their grandparents. That flattened silhouette is a hinge between continuity and change. What happens to those children and the knowledge they carry is at the center of the film's urgency. For now, the tide carries us onward. From the stilt villages we glide west into a narrow, crowded waterway where history rests on the skin of the sea itself. The Strait of Malacca is a place of layered memory, tidal channels, mangrove mouths, and the pale arcs of boats that once bore messages between kingdoms. Here, among reed-framed shelters and low-roped boats, live people often called the Orang Laut, the people of the sea, whose mastery of these passages shaped regional politics for centuries. Picture a low morning light cutting across a web of channels. Small outriggers slide past clumps of floating vegetation, guided by hands that have read this water for generations. The Orang Laut were not passive passengers on history's tides. For centuries, they were intermediaries and guardians of maritime routes, skilled in navigation, signaling, and the local knowledge that made trade and statecraft possible in an era before modern charts. Their expertise was an asset to sultanates that depended on reliable passage through the strait. Boats were diplomatic tools and eyes on the water. But what happens to a skill that once held strategic value when the world it served is reorganized? The answer is not simple. Colonial expansion, the consolidation of state authority, and the industrial scaling of shipping shifted the terms of maritime power. Where island navigators once mattered to a sultan's security, oceanic empires and then global commerce favored different infrastructures: larger ships, fixed ports, and formalized naval power. Skills that had been indispensable became less visible in the new maps. I spoke with a man named Karim, who is recognized among his neighbors as a keeper of older routes. He traced the lines of a faded map drawn by his grandfather, not a paper chart, but the mental map of currents and narrow cuts that could save a trader hours on a voyage. "We used to know which reefs the currents trusted," he said. "We guided. In the old days, kings asked for our routes. Now they ask for ship permits." His voice was steady. He did not speak as someone asking for pity. He spoke as someone describing a change in value. The Orang Laut story illustrates an important pattern in maritime histories. Specialized knowledge is inseparable from social roles. When political orders change, so too does the context that honors and sustains certain skills. In some places, Orang Laut communities adapted, taking wage labor in port towns or becoming small-scale fishers. In others, their ways of life were pushed to margins by shore reclamation, restriction of anchorage, and the disappearance of traditional patrons. There is loss here, but also persistence. Older navigational methods survive in the names people use for channels, in the songs that mark seasonal movements, and in informal networks that still ferry goods and people along the coast. A young woman I met, who learned to navigate by watching her aunt steer through fog, now runs a small transport service between islands. She negotiates with port officials, she carries cargo, she still tells of the old signs, a certain bird's flight over a shoal, a whisper of current against a mangrove root. Her life is hybrid, an example of adaptation rather than disappearance. From historical currents we travel to a present-day flashpoint where adaptation meets pressure, Sabah, in northeastern Borneo. Here, the sea is a stage for many of the forces we've seen in micro. Modern infrastructure, tourism, industrial fleets, and legal ambiguity converge on communities whose identities are forged on water. The Bajal of Sabah are connected by affinity and history to other Sama and Bajau groups across the region, yet their contemporary context has its own acute dynamics. Morning in a Bajal settlement looks like focused motion. Men push off in the earliest light, engines coughing to life, or, in less modern skiffs, paddles slipping. Women tend algae racks and small aquaculture plots near the shore. Children practice dives near the safety of bamboo piers. The smell of seaweed and frying fish hangs over the narrow walkways. There is stubborn continuity in these routines, but also constant negotiation with things new and large, cargo ships moving through adjacent channels, trawlers that alter fish stocks, roads that bring tourists to beaches that were once quiet. One family I followed balances multiple strategies. The father, Hamid, rose before dawn to check nets, then spent mid-morning patching a torn algae rack. His wife sells bundles of dried seaweed to a small cooperative that links the village to town markets. Their eldest daughter works in a guest house half an hour away, returning on weekends with stories of electricity and potential wages. "We do what we must," Hamid told me. "If the boats change, we change. But we keep what we can." His tone held both realism and stubborn care. Sabah has become, for many households, a place where livelihood must be diversified. Some families balance part-time wage labor on land with fishing and aquaculture at sea. Others adopt small entrepreneurial practices, guiding tourist snorkeling trips, repairing engines, selling produce in town. These adaptations are creative and pragmatic, but they do not erase the deeper structural pressures. Industrial trawlers, for instance, can alter the resource base in ways that pictures cannot fully capture. A trawler's net operates at scale, scooping species that small fishers relied on one basket at a time. Over time, this changes where fish congregate, which in turn affects daily knowledge about where to set nets, how long to wait, and which seasons to avoid fishing. Ports and coastal development change shoreline morphology, sometimes erasing quiet landing points or altering currents near reefs. Tour operators bring income, but can also displace customary anchoring areas or commodify rituals that communities once kept within their social fabric. In 2021, a genetic analysis linked to researchers at the University of Copenhagen drew attention because it suggested shared genetic markers among maritime populations that may relate to oxygen regulation and other physiological features. The report offered a picture of continuity across distant groups, a biological thread among people who have lived with breath-hold diving and maritime subsistence for generations. Here again, caution is essential. Genetics can reveal patterns of shared ancestry or selection, but it is only one piece of a multi-layered story. Cultural practices, social norms, economic choices and policies are at least as important in shaping how communities live today. The Bajal of Sabah responded to encroachment in many ways. Some families engaged local NGOs to assert claims to nearshore resources. Others formed cooperatives to market seaweed and fish. Still others sought formal documentation to obtain state services. These responses are not uniform, and outcomes vary. In interviews, community members expressed mixed feelings about documentation. While papers can ease access to healthcare and education, the processes to obtain them are costly, slow, and sometimes culturally alienating. There is also active resistance. A group of fishermen organized to map ancestral fishing grounds, pairing oral histories with GPS markers. Algae farmers experimented with more resilient species and started small market cooperatives to negotiate better prices. A youth collective held workshops teaching engine repair and sustainable harvesting techniques so that younger generations might find meaningful sea-based livelihoods without having to leave home entirely. These are not grand solutions. They are incremental, community-driven efforts that show agency and creativity. In one vivid scene I witnessed, a small flotilla of local boats gathered at dawn to chase a school of fish pushed into a narrow channel by a passing current. The operation required precise timing and coordination, boats forming a crescent to guide the fish into shallows, coordinated paddling to avoid startling the catch. Afterward, the catch was divided and sold in town. A portion was set aside for a ritual that marked the passing of a villager. The workday, the market, and the ritual were braided together. That braiding is part of what we risk losing when the economic and legal scaffolds of life on the water change. When we stitch together the stories of Bajau Laut, Moken, Sama, Orang Laut, and Bajal, certain patterns become clear. Bodies modified by practice, senses honed by place, knowledge passed in apprenticeship and song, and institutions that often fail to account for fluid forms of belonging. The consequences are practical and moral. Practical, because traditional ecological knowledge, is often a direct technology for survival. It predicts where storms will strike, how fish populations move, and when to avoid particular channels. Morale, because these are systems of meaning that anchor people's identities. To take away a seascape without the social structures that translate seascape into practice is to risk erasing a form of knowledge that took generations to build. Consider again the 2004 tsunami. The Moken example shows how oral tradition can be life-saving in the face of sudden crises. That lesson is not abstract. It demands attention to how policies are formed, who is at the table when coastal planning is decided, and whose voices are translated into early warning systems. When scientists and community elders meet, both bring strengths. The elder brings a localized, context-rich practice. The scientist brings tools for broader monitoring. The most robust strategies often come when these perspectives are treated as complementary rather than competitive. There is an ecological dimension to urgency as well. Reefs and mangroves act as buffers and nurseries. Their health affects fish abundance and shoreline stability. Many maritime communities possess fine-grained knowledge about reef recovery, spawning grounds, and seasonal productivity. When industrial activities damage these habitats, the loss is not only ecological, but epistemic. Species decline erodes the observational records and experiential feedback loops that tech depends on. But the conversation must resist a simplistic narrative that pits tradition against development. Community members themselves are not monolithically opposed to all change. Many welcome infrastructure that improves healthcare, schooling, and sanitation. The issue is often the rate and framing of change, when projects are planned without meaningful consultation or when development presumes sedentarization as inherent improvement. The cost is cultural knowledge. Where planning is inclusive, where economic choices are expanded rather than eliminated, outcomes can be more equitable. As our film moves toward its climax, we return to a few emblematic scenes I recorded in the Bajal settlements of Sabah. One evening, a community meeting gathered under a canopy of oil lamps. Men and women debated whether to allow a proposed pier project that promised increased market access but would also alter anchorage patterns. Voices rose and fell. An elder recalled the old order of tides. A younger entrepreneur spoke of business opportunities. There was no neat consensus. What I saw instead was a difficult democratic practice, neighbors translating competing priorities into a communal decision. The actors in these conversations are not helpless. They make claims, they form cooperatives, they learn new trades, they litigate or petition. They also grieve and lament changes that cut across their lives. The point is agency. When outsiders, scientists, policymakers, NGOs, enter these spaces, the ethical obligation is to listen with humility, to support locally led priorities, and to recognize that preservation can mean many things: legal recognition, habitat restoration, market access, or simply time and resources for elders to teach. There is a final and perhaps most solemn way to frame what is at stake. Knowledge that evolved over generations, whether a method for reading the sea, a ritual that governs harvests, or a set of embodied techniques for freediving, is not recoverable like a book from an archive once it is gone. It is lived, performed, and transmitted in contexts that are social and material. When children no longer practice dives, when elders no longer have pupils, when landing sites vanish, the lines of transmission fray. Reconstructing that tacit knowledge is sometimes impossible. At other times, it is costly and imperfect. That realization brings us back to a moral question rather than a predictive one. What obligations do we have to protect not only ecosystems, but the living knowledge embedded in human communities? If the sea is not simply a resource, but a partner and a school, then conservation and cultural preservation must be entangled projects. Protecting reefs without protecting the people who read them is incomplete. Recognizing maritime citizenship without accounting for the forms it takes, mobile, fluid, and relational, is inadequate. So what can be done in practice? There are no magic fixes. But the film does point to approaches that have shown promise. Co-designed marine protected areas that include customary practices, documentation projects that pair elders with youth and create living curricula, legal reforms that recognize non-territorial forms of belonging, market linkages that sustain livelihoods without erasing cultural practices. Importantly, these are not external impositions. Their legitimacy depends on community leadership and consent. As the sun set over the settlements where I filmed, children ran along the narrow decks and dove into a sea that knows them by sound and shadow. In that light, practices looked less like relics and more like ongoing experiments, ways of living that continuously adapt to change while holding certain forms of knowledge dear. I watched a boy of perhaps 10 years lift himself onto a hull, take a breath, and slip below the surface. When he returned, he laughed and pointed at something small and bright he had found under a rock. A commonplace discovery, a learning moment, a thread in a long tradition. The urgency in this story is real. The pressures of industrial fishing, coastal development, and legal invisibility accumulate, and at certain thresholds they can sever lines of transmission. But urgency does not necessitate despair. It requires orientation and response. Listening is the first act. Supporting community-led documentation, legal recognition, and economic pathways that preserve maritime practices are other parts of a broader response. We began with a simple sensory image: water under the feet, the sway of a house, the constancy of tide. That image returns now as a closing hinge. The peoples we met, Bajau Laut, Moken, Sama, Orang Laut, Bajal, live with the sea as home, school, and temple. Their knowledge has taught the world about human plasticity and cultural ingenuity. Their practices have saved lives, managed ecosystems, and knit social worlds across watery geographies. If you take one thing from this film, let it be this. When land does not exist as the primary foundation for a people, other institutions arise to do the work. Land-based assumptions take for granted. Family networks, apprenticeship systems, ritual calendars, and the very structuring of daily labor become the scaffolding of life. Those scaffolds are fragile to policy and market forces that assume a different kind of citizenry. This documentary does not offer final answers. It offers instead an invitation. Listen to these voices. Learn the names of channels and currents from those who live there. Support efforts that center community priorities. If you are moved to learn more, the description below points to resources and organizations working alongside maritime peoples on conservation, legal recognition, and cultural documentation. Finally, as dusk folded into night and children dove one last time beneath a low, molten sky, I felt the same combination of wonder and responsibility that has carried me through these waters. The sea had taught me to pay attention not only to spectacle, but to the quiet ways knowledge is handed down. A song hummed over a net, a notch on a boat's prow, the way an elder's eyes slow over a current. Those small practices are the true archive of a people who have for centuries discovered ways to live where land does not exist. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments which maritime culture you think we should explore next. Share this film with someone who cares about heritage and conservation, and check the description for further reading and partner organizations supporting coastal communities. Thank you for coming aboard and for listening to these voices before they fade into the tide.